Every powerful person you admire went quiet before they became dangerous. If you're alone right now, it's not rejection, it's preparation. If you feel disconnected, misunderstood, and alone, you're not lost, you're being trained. We're taught that being alone means something went wrong, that if people pulled away, if messages stopped coming, if the room got quieter, then we must have failed somehow. But that idea only exists to keep you dependent on noise. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you're surrounded by people, you're constantly reacting to opinions, reacting to approval, reacting to pressure. You're not thinking clearly. You're adjusting yourself just to fit in. And that's exactly why separation changes you. When the noise disappears, something else shows up. Clarity. You start hearing your own thoughts without interruption. You notice patterns you ignored before. You recognize who drained you, who benefited from your confusion, and who only stayed when you were useful. This is what Niccolò Machiavelli observed over and over again. He didn't study ideal friendships. He studied power. And power never grows in crowded rooms. It grows in distance. Isolation forces you to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. And discomfort sharpens awareness. You stop making emotional decisions just to feel accepted. You begin choosing what serves you long-term, not what feels good short-term. Most people can't handle this phase. They rush back to distractions. They fill the silence with people who don't matter, just to avoid facing themselves. But if you stay, if you don't run from the quiet, you start changing. You become harder to manipulate, harder to rush, harder to shake. And that's when you realize something unsettling. You weren't abandoned, you were being prepared. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because this phase exposes something most people don't want to admit. When you step back from everyone, you don't just lose company, you lose illusions. You start seeing how much of your life was built around reactions instead of intention. How many choices were made just to avoid being alone? How often you stayed quiet to keep the peace? And suddenly, you're not numb anymore. That's why this stage feels heavy. Silence doesn't distract you, it confronts you. You replay conversations differently. You notice patterns. You realize who respected you only when you were useful and who disappeared the moment you stopped performing. This is exactly what Niccolò Machiavelli understood. Distance doesn't weaken a person. It reveals the truth. And truth is dangerous. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's the real shift, though. Your emotions stop running the show. When you're constantly surrounded by people, emotions are triggered nonstop. Envy, fear, validation, pressure. But in isolation, emotions lose their grip. You start responding instead of reacting, thinking instead of exploding, observing instead of begging to be understood. And that's power most people never reach. So let me ask you something, and be honest. Have you noticed you're harder to impress lately? Do you feel less interested in explaining yourself? Are you starting to prefer silence over fake conversations? Have people told you that you've changed, but can't explain how? If so, here's the real question. Are you lonely, or are you outgrowing the room? Drop a comment and tell me, what changed for you when you started spending more time alone? Because chances are someone else watching needs to hear your answer. What most people never realize is that isolation isn't random. It follows a pattern. And once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Before influence, there is distance. Before respect, there is disappearance. Before authority, there is a season where no one is watching. This isn't coincidence. It's preparation. Look closely at how power actually forms. People don't rise while surrounded by applause. They rise when they step away long enough to rebuild themselves without interference. When they stop explaining. When they stop competing loudly. When they stop reacting to every opinion thrown at them. That withdrawal isn't weakness, it's strategy. This is something Niccolò Machiavelli understood deeply. He observed that leaders often vanish before they return transformed, not to escape, but to refine. Distance gives perspective. Perspective gives control. When you're alone, you're no longer being shaped by expectations. You're shaping yourself, your priorities harden, your tolerance for nonsense drops. You stop wasting energy on people who don't move you forward. And slowly, something shifts. You don't chase attention anymore. You don't rush decisions. You don't feel the need to prove who you are. That's when presence changes. People feel it before they understand it. Your silence carries weight. Your words land heavier because you don't scatter them. You're not louder, but you're more precise, more grounded, more difficult to ignore. Most people never reach this stage because they mistake visibility for progress. They think being seen means being powerful. But power doesn't announce itself. It consolidates quietly. It sharpens privately. And when it finally shows up, it doesn't ask permission. That's why this phase feels invisible, because it's not meant to impress anyone yet. Once distance has done its work, something else begins to happen, and this is where the transformation becomes real. Isolation doesn't just remove people from your life, it filters them. After that quiet season where no one is watching, you don't come back the same. You come back selective. The tolerance you once had for noise, drama, and empty connection is gone. This is the natural continuation of what we just talked about. When you disappear long enough, weak attachments fall away on their own. Not because you push people out, but because they couldn't survive without access to you. What remains is clarity. You stop chasing familiarity. You stop mistaking comfort for loyalty. This is exactly why Niccolò Machiavelli believed distance was essential. He understood that power requires clean surroundings. Too many emotional ties dilute judgment. Too many voices soften resolve. Loneliness forces you to confront yourself without distractions. And that confrontation hardens you in a good way. You learn restraint, you learn patience, you learn how to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. Most people never make it through this phase. They mistake the quiet for emptiness. They rush back to the same circles just to feel something again. And in doing so, they undo the refinement that was happening. But if you stay, if you let the filter finish its job, you notice a shift. You don't explain yourself as much. You don't overcommit. You don't feel pulled in every direction. Your world gets smaller but stronger. And that's the connection. Distance creates silence. Silence creates discernment. And discernment creates control. This isn't loneliness anymore. This is selection. What was once isolation becomes structure. What felt like loss becomes leverage. And from here, you're no longer reacting to life. You're choosing it. After selection comes something even quieter, but far more dangerous. You stop needing approval. This is the stage most people never reach because it requires letting go of the last addiction, being understood. After distance filtered your world and silence sharpened your judgment, you no longer feel the urge to explain yourself to people who aren't listening anyway. Your energy changes here. You don't argue as much. You don't rush to correct misunderstandings. You don't chase closure from people who already showed you who they are. This isn't arrogance. It's efficiency. When you were surrounded by noise, you reacted emotionally. When you stepped away, you gained clarity. Now you gain restraint. You speak when it matters. You move when it counts. And when you stay silent, it's intentional, not passive. This is where Niccolò Machiavelli becomes especially relevant. He understood that power leaks through unnecessary explanation. The more you justify yourself, the more control you hand away. Authority isn't loud, it's decisive. At this stage, your presence alone starts doing the work. People feel that you're not easily pulled, not easily rushed, not easily shaken. And that changes how they approach you. Some respect it, others feel threatened by it. Either way, you're no longer chasing reactions. You're setting the tone. You also become comfortable with being misunderstood. That's the real test, because once you stop needing validation, you stop being predictable. And unpredictability is strength. This connects everything that came before. Distance gave you space. Silence gave you clarity. Selection gave you structure. Now restraint gives you control. You're no longer shaped by who's around you or who isn't. You're anchored, grounded, self-directed. And here's the quiet truth. When you reach this point, loneliness disappears. Not because people return, but because you no longer depend on them to feel whole. You're not isolated anymore. You're sovereign. By now, the pattern should be clear. What once felt like loss was never meant to stay that way. The distance, the silence, the disappearing, it wasn't there to break you. It was there to complete the work. It couldn't happen in public. This is the stage where you stop questioning the process. You no longer ask why people left. You no longer replay old conversations. You no longer measure yourself by who stayed or who didn't. Instead, you move forward with quiet certainty. This is where preparation turns into presence. You don't announce your return. You don't explain the change. You let outcomes speak. The discipline you built in isolation shows up in how you think, how you decide, and how you carry yourself. This is the final Machiavellian lesson. Power doesn't seek recognition. It commands it without asking. You understand now that not everyone is meant to walk with you into your next phase. Some were only meant to get you to the door. And that's not bitterness, that's clarity. The loneliness that once felt heavy now feels distant, not because life got louder, but because you got stronger. And when people finally notice the shift, they'll ask what happened. You won't feel the need to answer because you already know. You weren't falling behind, you were being prepared.